This segment is on the homeostasis of normal blood glucose levels. Normally, blood glucose levels are 70 to 110 milligrams per deciliter. When the blood glucose level gets out of this range, it can cause a lot of problems for the body. If the blood glucose level gets above 110, we call that hyperglycemia. If the blood glucose level gets below 70, we call that hypoglycemia. Now, on a daily basis, the body has to be able to keep the blood glucose level in that range. And this becomes a problem after you eat. The blood glucose level goes up really high, and so the body has to try to bring it back down. And after you haven't eaten in quite a few hours, then the blood glucose level is pretty low, and the body has to bring the blood glucose levels back up, always trying to keep it in this 70 to 110 milligrams per deciliter region. So let's look at what would happen if we had some disturbance in the normal blood glucose. There are two hormones that both come from the pancreas. One is called glucagon, and that comes from the alpha cells in the pancreas, and the other one is insulin, and that comes from the beta cells in the pancreas. And they are the two that are going to help to maintain homeostasis, maintain that level of 70 to 110 milligrams per deciliter. Let's look at what would happen if the disturbance of blood glucose brought the blood glucose levels down. So we have falling blood glucose levels. The alpha cells of the pancreas would secrete glucagon, and glucagon then will do a couple of things to bring that blood glucose level back up. The first thing that it will do is it will stimulate the breakdown of glycogen. We know what glycogen is. Glycogen is a stored form of glucose, and so if our blood glucose levels are low, then if we break down that stored glucose, we can then liberate that glucose, and we can use that then for our cells. The second thing is that we will have an increased breakdown of fat to fatty acids. These fatty acids then can be used as energy as well in the absence of glucose. So we get these fatty acids from the fat that's stored in adipose tissue. And the last thing that can happen is that the glucagon will stimulate the liver to make new glucose, and we call this gluconeogenesis. These three mechanisms, breaking down glycogen, breaking down fat, and creating new glucose, will then bring the blood glucose level back into the normal range of 70 to 110 milligrams per deciliter. Let's say that we have the exact opposite situation occurring, where instead of having falling glucose levels, we now have increased glucose levels or rising blood glucose levels. When this happens, the beta cells in the pancreas will secrete insulin. Insulin has many functions. It will increase the rate of glucose transport into the target cells. So in other words, insulin carries glucose into cells. By carrying the glucose into the cells, we get it out of the blood. The other thing insulin does is it causes the cells to use the glucose that has been transported into the cells. In this way, the cells can create more energy, create more ATP, but also we're able to get rid of the glucose that was causing the high glucose levels. Another thing that insulin does is it will cause glucose to be converted to glycogen. In this way, any of the glucose that isn't being used immediately can get stored in this structure called glycogen. Insulin also causes amino acids to be absorbed and protein to be synthesized. In this way, we're taking out the components that the body would normally use to make new glucose on its own. And the last thing is that insulin will cause an increase in triglyceride synthesis in the adipose tissue. So here we see that if we have falling blood glucose levels, the alpha cells will secrete glucagon, and we'll have several effects in order to increase the blood glucose levels again. This is going to occur in a state that's called post-absorptive. So this is after we haven't eaten in several hours and our blood glucose levels are starting to fall, and it's in the post-absorptive state. When we have rising glucose levels, this is usually right after we get done eating a meal, and we call this the absorptive state. And since we have a lot of glucose that's abundant in the blood, the body has to do several things through the action of insulin in order to decrease the blood glucose level, and both of these mechanisms are used to maintain normal blood glucose levels at 70 to 110 milligrams per deciliter.